So one area that you think really relies on free expression and pushing the boundaries is comedy, but even comedy is kind of falling under the spell of cancel culture. You know, the famously offensive comedian Jerry Sadowitz had his show pulled from the Edinburgh Fringe. We learned this kind of last week. So, they've finally come for Sadowitz. What's going on here?
That's what's so strange about it, because I always thought like Jerry Sadowitz was like as woke and as a liberal and as, you know, just soaked in all of the kind of usual prejudices of our age as the Fringe is. And that's what many of the prominent comedians and all the people involved in it are. Sadowitz was always like the exception that people would make, because his material is, his onstage persona is every kind of ism and phobia you can think of. It's racism, it's sexism, it's misogyny, general depravity.
Getting out his penis
was one of the things that damned him in this situation. But there was always this kind of understanding. First of all, because people recognise he was brilliant. It's hilarious, and and you are laughing in spite of yourself. But there was this sense of like, that's different. That's art. Yeah, we can. So even though every so often there'd be a kind of controversy around, there's a bit few too many rape jokes at the Fringe this year, or this particular show has upset some people. He was always like kind of held up as the exception. So for the Pleasance, one of the big four venues at the Fringe, to turn around in the face of complaints, seemingly in large part from people who work there, who are often kind of students who get jobs for the summer working at the Fringe or whatever. That they've cancelled him, it's really, really remarkable. And you see that in a lot of the response from even people who you wouldn't expect to come out on the side of free speech. But it's just inevitable, isn't it? How could Jerry Sadowitz and that, like, his survive in an era when we're told that context doesn't really matter? Yeah. That if people can't laugh at anything with a glint of irony, if they're laughing at a particularly grim joke, it's because they just share in the prejudices being portrayed on stage. We have kind of arrived at a point where, particularly with things like comedy and things of that kind of art forms of that nature, people genuinely really struggle to make the distinction between a performance and actually like saying it just, you know, in real life. So I suppose it was inevitable, but that doesn't make it any less nuts that this is what's happened in this case.
Ella, is it just people being so literal minded that they cannot see that, you know, someone saying something racist for laughs is not the same as actually being racist and spreading racial hatred or whatever? I
think it is. And I think it's a kind of willful unwillingness to engage in an art form, which is, you know, comedy is different to theatre, it's different to singing songs, but there is a degree to which you kind of leave reality at the door and you enter the, you know, the dark room of the comedy club. It's, you know, they've set up that way for a reason, and you enter into a different world. Someone on Twitter shared an anecdote about a Sadowitz performance that they'd seen 10, 15 years ago. And it's really interesting to I'm just going to briefly tell you it, because the whole point was that Sadowitz was talking about this inability to differentiate between Jerry, the man who you see walking his dog or whatever on a Saturday, and Jerry on stage. And he was sort of saying to the audience, I know it's hard for you to understand that I'm doing a performance. Don't worry, I've got a table full of hats back here. And I'm going to put the hat on so that when I put the hat on, you know that I'm not being me, I'm being someone else. And he went to the back of the stage, and his silence, because everyone's thinking, Jesus Christ, what's he going to do? And he comes back with an SS officer's cap on and says, and his hands on his hips, says, okay, what are we going to do about these Jews then? Which is horrendous.
And he's Jewish himself.
Yeah, you know, the whole place erupts with laughter, because actually what he's doing there is saying something quite profound about the skill of what you do when you're a comedian. We forget this. So much of comedy and the timing of jokes and everything is in a shock factor. And Sadowitz's entire material, as Tom says, is about shock, is about, I cannot believe he's just said this. You would never, ever hear this said before. And actually, it's kind of a cathartic experience. People think that when people laugh at a sexist joke, for example, that they leave the theatre and are going to be horrible to women. That's not what happens. That would be a complete misunderstanding of what's going on in that dark room. It's that you kind of... It's almost like telling the emperor he's got no clothes. It's like calling out all this stuff. It's a kind of way in which you exercise things, and you don't, and it means bogeymen don't get created, because what happens when you don't talk about these things and you have this sort of ridiculous idea of the public that if they hear anything derogatory or anything with an ism, they're going to repeat it, then we know in wider politics that stuff festers, and actually that's when things go underground. But, so in a way you can say, I don't know how he'd feel about this, but Sadowitz is doing a kind of public service in his act in that, okay, and if you don't want to go out and see him get his dick out on stage, which is what he does, then you might want to heed the 18 plus warning that the Pleasance Theatre put on the show.
They were very well warned. There was an 18 plus warning. The name of the show was not for anyone.
Yeah.
There was previous shows where he was called, comedian, magician, psychopath, and all this sort of stuff. Equal opportunities offender was another one. Like all of it's very well signposted. That if you walk
and there's loads of nudity at the Fringe. There are loads of women who do vagina monologues, for Christ's sake. What is this kind of prudishness?
People should have realised what they were getting in for. And I'd take your point there about being a kind of vent and all the rest of it. But I think there's also an element with this band, also or this Clampdown, but also others, I'm sure, where there's an element of like people feeling like the political imperative has to come before anything else.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's one of the things that's very distinct about Sadowitz is that he never really breaks character. He's never like it's never kind of like I'm doing this to make a positive point.
Yeah.
It's just letting vent to this venom. Like it's kind of that's the point in it, and expressing it in a remarkably funny, punchy, almost poetic way. There's no other reason for it other than that. It's just to sort of be a piece of art, essentially. But we do live in a time where everything has to be subject to like this broader political imperative.
Yeah.
You either have to, serve the interests of social justice, how they would define it, or not talk about anything, or just talk about, in-flight meals or something.
Yeah.
Those are the two options that you have. And the fact that there's no space for him is a really bad sign. I mean, it does just show that you do just kill comedy if you embrace these kinds of ideas. And that feels like it's a hackneyed phrase at this point. But when someone who, certainly even amongst the kind of fringe establishment, everyone knows is like a real great.
Yeah.
The fact that even he's been caught up in this, I think demonstrates that point, is that not only if you take on this kind of intolerance and this woke censorship, but if you basically believe that art has to be put to work, it has to do something, it has to push in the right direction, then it's deadening and it kills the art form. And this is one neat example of that, I guess.
Although I have to say, I would listen to him talk about in-flight meals as well.